Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hired, a show that uses hiring as a way to explore culture, diversity, and the human experience. I'm Mike Thompson, and on the show today, we have Serena Ness, a fearless innovator in the project management space, who will share why soft skills are the most important when hiring, the importance of vulnerability and authenticity in the hiring process, why interview prep is not limited to just candidates, and how to personalize the job description. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Now we jump into the fun stuff.
All right.
So I'm going to tee it up with, obviously hiring in the project management space is hard and it's challenging right now. So to set the table for this discussion, why do you think that it is such a challenge right now?
I think we're all still dealing with remote, global, and being in different places and being dispersed. So traditionally, project management, what people really relied on, I personally relied on, was the ability to interact with the teams personally, whether I was traveling to visit them or just co-located in the office, even if you're running between floors. A lot of what project management does is a lot of implementation, adoption, and getting people on board via influence and via interactions. And a lot of that happens when you're able to, run over to somebody's desk or tap on, knock on the door, or even walking from a scrum meeting and then walking back to the desk. A lot of business happens when you're having those casual conversations and you're able to cut through and get things done. And I think just it's like everybody else, probably like most of the industry and most work, it's harder to affect that when everything is scheduled via a Zoom call. And so when the call starts, the call ends, and it's just not as simple to affect business in that casual way and influence. I know personally for me, I had to learn different muscles when I hit that COVID time and everything went remote. I very much relied on taking a pulse of a room and seeing how we were doing or having that casual conversation. And I really had to learn how to leverage the ability to use Zoom and tune into that, but also figure out other ways to reach out to people so that we can keep that momentum going.
Now, you bring up an interesting point because, in our conversations, the role of a project manager hasn't necessarily changed over the last couple of years, but it's made it more difficult with this remote style of working, as you kind of alluded to. Is there certain skills that you've had to learn or project managers that are in your PMO have had to learn to be more effective in their ability to influence because they're not physically in the same space?
Well, I would say to your exact point, and we did chat about this a little bit before, one of the most underestimated skills or capabilities, if you will, that I think project management needs and is a must to have is that soft skill management. And that soft skill management has what to do with your influencing skills, your listening skills, et cetera, and your ability to be empathetic. And I do think that is harder, obviously, in a remote setting versus being able to be physically present and with some people. So I think it has always been a necessary skill for project managers to have. I think most project management, even if you're a centrally located PMO, your stakeholders are likely matrixed and diverse across an organization, whether it's internally or if you're dealing with vendors externally, and the ability to then therefore get people to do the work you need them to do because you're the project manager, right? You need to make sure an effect and outcome, and you're pulling in data points and people and pieces of work from all different kinds, front office, back office, customer, client, vendors, et cetera. And they usually have competing priorities relative. They're not just doing the work for you and they don't report to you. So you need to find a way to motivate them and influence them to get the work that you need to get done and prioritize that or you need to appreciate if they can't. And a lot of that is listening and talking and soft skill management and reading them and getting a sense of where they're at, what their conflicts are, what's blocking the work, et cetera. And so, yeah, I think it's always been a necessary skill. It's something that I always look for my project managers. I do think it's harder, obviously, in a remote setting.
Now, it's interesting because there's a lot of debate now about even the term soft skills, where, we call them that because traditionally that's what they're called for, but they're anything but soft. They're not, it just in terms of how the name suggests is, especially in project management, they are the skills.
Right.
These are the skills that determine success. So if they are project management skills that are required, how do you hire for that? And in terms of, it's got to be a challenge to attract, assess, like assess that even on a resume. How do you do that? And then in the interview, and I know that's a loaded question, so let's just start with, maybe attract and assess. If those are the main skills, you as a leader, when you are going to the market to look, how do you make sure you attract those right skills, and how are you assessing that as it comes through on the resume?
So the resume is a hard read. We'll start there because that's, before you're really chatting with somebody. When I look at a resume, I want to see that somebody has a bit of a diverse portfolio of work that they've done, different types of work and projects that they've done. So even if they've always been, let's just say they spent 5 years in the same company and always in tech, but they did, let's say, all different kinds of projects within tech, well, then that shows me that they've had to work through different demographics of people. If
Hmm.
they did contract lifecycle management, they likely had to work with legal. If they did a floor build out or a data center build out, they dealt with the network and engineers, and they also dealt with facilities and contractors and construction. So if I see that they've had different types of work, even within the same company, even within the same department of technology, it gives me a sense that they've had to work with different types of people. And in theory, then they probably have built up a repository of different ways of working with different types of archetypes of people. And I think that's important. That shows me that they have ability to flex with people, that they can socialize with different types of people, in theory, if they've been successful, obviously, in implementations. So I think that is just initially what I would look at. When it comes to actually, once I get to the interviewing process, and this is something that I've changed over the years. In the beginning, when I was first interviewing people earlier on in my career, you start from the skills, like, do they know Microsoft Office suite? How, you go through the strategy, you start to, pressure test where they might, how do you build a project plan, and you might ask very basic kind of skills oriented questions like that, which might say that, hey, they can use Microsoft Project. Great, maybe not great. They know how to use Jira. They know how to use these different tools. And then they might be able to spit back to me, and this is how you do change management, and this is how you do stakeholder management. This is how you do a communication plan. But that is something that, in theory, people can memorize. Like, okay, that's all very good. But then what I really start to get into is scenario-based interviewing, and I think that's where you really start, well, 2 things. One, scenario-based interviewing, and that's where you get a real sense of how people have worked through it, meaning project management at the end of the day is a playbook. And it's very flat. It's a playbook. If you just take that playbook and throw it at a project, you're not going to be successful. I guarantee you're not going to be successful. And honestly, project management 101 is taking that playbook, whether it's at whatever methodology you're using, whatever strategy you're using, and figuring out how to adapt while still keeping true to it, keeping the integrity of what you're trying to do, but figure out how to adapt to your organizational environmental constraints. And I think that's where some of that soft skill management comes in. That comes with people ability to flex, understand their environment, understand their demographic. And so I go to scenario based interviewing and I ask people, you, I don't just ask people, what have you done when you've had conflict? Because people probably have a staged answer for that. But I might ask them, what's your approach for stakeholder buy-in, and when has it worked for you and when hasn't it worked for you and what have you done about it? Or what's an example of a difficult stakeholder and what do you do about it? What was a project that you failed at? Why? Because I think it's okay to fail. I want to see that people are open-minded to that. So for an example, from a capability perspective, I want people to be comfortable with failing, but then also having figured out what to do about it for next time. So that's one thing of it, scenario-based conversation and interviewing, and that could really do with the type of role that you're trying to hire for. And then 2 other things, which I think is really critical just to really get to know the person. One, what do you do on your spare time?
Mm.
I think that becomes a very interesting conversation, and you get to relax a little bit in that conversation and get a chance to know people. And then you get a sense of their creative side. That's one. And the other one is, I think, a very interesting question is what motivates you, but also what doesn't motivate you? Like what
Hmm.
really drags you down? And that really will give you a sense also in terms of what the person really enjoys doing, and therefore, are they a values fit for your culture or what you're hiring for or not? And there is no right or wrong answer. Everybody's a different kind of person, but you want to try to make sure that person can fit into your culture.
I want to unpack what you just said there because you said a lot of great things, specifically when we talk about scenario-based questions, and I love that, focusing on the skills, less about right or wrong, and more about tell me a story about this, right? To assess, what they've learned from the experience and things that way. That could be a difficult thing for candidates to feel comfortable being vulnerable, knowing that traditionally in an interview you're right or wrong, and there's an answer you want to hear and I'm trying to give you the answer that you want to hear and not make myself look as bad in the process. But that's also not real. So, how do you create an environment in an interview that allows me or the candidate to feel comfortable to tell you an authentic story and not be judged by it?
So the first thing I do, and I've done this for over a decade, when I sit down with somebody, and I think also this is very critical, the first thing I say is, "Hey, this is bi-directional. We're here to get to know each other. I'm not just interviewing you, you're interviewing me. So I just want to have a conversation. I want to have a dialogue because this has to work out for me, but it also has to work out for you. So I want you to feel comfortable asking me questions. I'm definitely going to leave time in the end. I always tell them, I'm going to pepper in based on what you say how I think this would play in the culture that I'm interviewing for or the val so I try to give them the same feedback. I want them to come away because it goes a little bit back to what you and I were just literally talking about before you hit the record button. I want people to walk away with a sense of knowledge where they have gained as much information from me as I have gained from them,
Mm,
so that they feel comfortable to make a good decision. At the end of the day, if I make them an offer and they decide to accept, we're both placing a bet on each other. And I want them to come in eyes wide open, and I want to come in eyes wide open with them. So I tell them that straight up front, like, this is about you getting to know us and us getting to know you. And a lot of times I'll say, "Hey, if you had a choice between A, B, and C, what would you choose?" And I'll say there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just trying to get a sense of what interests you. Because at the end of the day, if they're not interested or if they just give me this flat answer, and then I try to go ahead and I hire them and they put them in the role, they're going to be miserable. I'm going to be miserable. Nobody's going to be happy. And I tell them that. Like, I want you to be happy. I want you to love this job. So let's keep this as a dialogue.
I, there's a reason why we get along so well, and I think the what you just said is refreshing, and I think a lot of organizations and leaders are having an issue with this change of being vulnerable in the sense where it is two-way in an interview. Like it's not just you picking whoever you get to pick and they're obviously going to accept. There's options that candidates have to decide if they want to. So setting the stage and setting the table early on to say that puts people at ease to ask questions. And if I want to give you the opportunity now, if you're to speak to candidates, because I want to be conscious of the environment we're in now, what advice would you give to candidates if they're interviewing in different scenarios now on how they would go about maybe asking the right questions or making sure that they're getting that information to make the right choice? Do you have any advice for candidates going through the interview process?
Yeah, I would say a few things. And I know this is very social media-esque, but I think it's important as well. There's a balance of, being your authentic self and being a professional. So I wouldn't say, come in with your dog on your lap and saying, "Hey, here's my authentic self," et cetera. It's a corporate environment. You want to make sure that you're presenting yourself appropriately. But at the end of the day, I do think it's important to be your authentic self. If you have a tough question, ask the tough question. If it actually works out that for whatever reason you offend the hiring manager or the person interviewing you, then it probably wasn't meant to be to begin with. So if you're the type of person that if that's the way you're going to operate in your day-to-day environment, be that person on the interview. It's the best way for that hiring manager or the person interviewed to get a sense about you. And it's the best way for you to get a sense if you're going to be a fit for them and that culture. So I think what both the hiring manager has to do and the candidate has to do is I always think about things in at three levels, but values, capabilities, and skills, and in that order. Meaning the first most important thing, because it's the hardest thing to change about anybody or change about yourself, is what are your values? What matters to you?
Hmm.
And the company probably has a sense of values that gets embodied into a culture. And you probably have your own sense of values that's part of your culture and how you operate. And so you want to have those kinds of questions to make sure that that your values match and a culture match for them, and they're getting that sense about you. And capabilities are the way people think, operate, decision make, etc. So when they're asking you questions about how do you deal with risk management? How do you deal with a tough stakeholder? What's been your best stakeholder? What's been your worst stakeholder? Why? What have you done about it? How have you leveraged it for better? How have you They're just trying to get a sense of how you might react in their environment and how that would go against their culture. You want to be as honest as you can so that you can understand if the culture is a match for you. So I would just say bring your true self, be professional, but bring your true self. Ask the tough questions so that everybody, again, that bi-directional, everybody gets a sense of each other.
Yeah, and I think that it's becoming more and more comfortable for people to do that, and I
Mhm.
think that it's changing in the right way, and there is that balance right now, and you're seeing that with, LinkedIn and social media, people trying to figure out how they can bring themselves into the corporate world, but still be respectful of the fact that it is a corporate world, but not be the version that they think everybody wants them to be, but be themselves, because that's ultimately how they're going to find the right match for them, whether it's the company or the leader they're working for. Now, it
One
seems
one thing I would add, Mike, only because
yes.
I think we're at a very interesting time when it comes to interviews and people entering the workforce in general. So, um, my youngest is 24. So he graduated college during COVID. He got his first job during COVID. And so he's never been in an office. He interviewed everything online. He's never been in an office. He's an engineer, so they haven't asked him to come into an office. It's a very different world for him in terms of how he interacts and how he works with his virtual team than it was for me when I started my corporate career. Just the whole
Mm,
I think the generation that graduated and started to work in COVID and having never have experienced an in-office experience, I think the challenges are a little bit different. I yell at him. I tell him to go into the office, meet the people, and he's actually planning on going in December to meet everybody for the first time. I think it's important, but I think it's a different. It goes back to that soft skill management. You really have to pay attention when you're online in a different kind of way and look for different kind of signals than you can being in a room with people, whether you're interviewing. So in an interview, if you're sitting across from the person, you get a sense of their body language. You get they're leaning in, leaning out. Are they looking at you? Are they looking down or whatever? Are they taking notes? It's much different to interview face to face than it is to interview on Zoom. And I think that is just something I think everybody's still trying to figure out, because you're interviewing from your home as opposed to interviewing from in an office. Maybe you're not wearing the suit jacket, but maybe you should. Like things like that. I think we're still trying to figure out.
have you on that point? I think it's great, and have you thought of or tried different things while you're interviewing people virtually versus because you've been interviewing and hiring people physically for a period of time, and then all of a sudden now everything switches to virtual, and you have to get to know someone in this form for the first time and make a call if they're going to be a fit. Have you figured out a way on how to do that effectively, or any tips?
So one, I would insist on it being a video call. Not all of them have been like just like, no, I want a video call. So I think it's important to be able to see somebody. I think it's also even more important as the person. I can give you both perspective, but as a person doing the interviewing, so I'm the hiring manager. I'm interviewing you. Prep my questions in advance. Read the resume in advance because looking down it's so dismissive to the person who you're interviewing. And maybe you're looking down because you haven't had a chance to look at the resume or you're trying to figure out what questions you want to ask. I think it requires prep on both sides actually so that you can look in the camera and look at each other as much as possible. And then I think just from a hiring manager perspective, prep in advance, insist on the video call. Definitely create that same relaxed environment. I don't think that changes, et cetera, because you want to have that easy dialogue. And if you're being the person that's being interviewed, dress up a little bit. Don't put something on. Just take it like you're in the office, and you might be wearing your slippers on your feet, or maybe you're wearing sweatpants on the bottom, but Definitely definitely dress up a little bit on top and look professional, sit up straight, and do your prep too about the company. They'll be able to tell if you're searching some word, like what you so do your prep. Don't assume that you're going to do it real time. Do your prep as well, as if you were going to be in the office and you didn't have that accessibility to go Google something on the side.
I love what you're talking about, the prep beforehand on both sides. And, I think because conducting interviews on video is much more efficient. You don't have to travel, there's no transit. You can really stack them if you're a hiring manager, run right after the other. You think you're being more productive with your time because you're evaluating and interviewing more people. But if you're not actually preparing effectively for each one of them, then you're kind of not getting the most out of that. And when I advise candidates to go on an interview, I tell them the first question they should ask is, what do you like about me? Why am I here? And
Mhm.
that's telling, because employers on the other side always say, like, why us? Why this company? They want to see, like, are you serious? How serious are you in this process? And I like to flip it and say, like, well, what was it about my resume that got you excited to have this conversation? And that's the kick off the meeting. Now and now you can get into a deeper conversation. If the hiring manager has done their homework and they're like, why you're here, Serena, as they're looking at this and I like these things, great. Now you can focus on those and have a
Right.
conversation. Where if they're literally scanning, then that's tell as well. So, like,
Yeah.
I always like to give them that question to throw back and kind of say, like, this is an interview on both sides, and I want to make sure that you've done your prep as I've done mine. And I always say, if you're going to ask that question, make sure you've done your prep too, because
Right.
they're going to turn around and ask you as well.
I'd also add on that when the interview's over for both people, um, and this should, whether you're in person or you're virtual, take notes. Take notes right after, especially if you're the candidate. You're going to be interviewing, let's just say, with 4 or 5 different people. Chances are it's not a one and done. Chances are you might be interviewing with several people, stakeholders. Take notes. You know, doesn't have to be long and exhaustive. Maybe even during the meeting, jot a few things down, but even afterwards, what what turned you on about talking to that person? What motivated you? What do you have further questions about? You know, what did you really like to hear? And try to find something that was somewhat personal in that conversation that, was that with directly with that person, not just about the job, but, oh, Mike likes skiing, or Mike said something really interesting about this role, and this specific capability required, and jot it down. And I think that's important because I still think I'm old school. I'm old school, but I still think it's important to send a follow-up note, whether you're setting a follow-up note to the recruiter or you happen to have the emails with the person that you interviewed with. Definitely send a note out. It shouldn't be like 17 pages long, but why you enjoyed the interview, what you learned within that interview that made you think that you were a fit for the job, and then why, like, what are some of the details from your resume, and then express whatever it is that you want to happen next. Looking forward to next steps, et cetera, et cetera. If A lot of times, if you're doing back-to-back interviews over 2 or 3 days and you're meeting with, I don't know, anywhere from 4 to 5 people, you're going to forget who you had what conversation with. It's just natural. Take the notes, do your due diligence, and then make sure you have the ability to crisply send out a quick follow-up note. Again, one follow-up note to the hiring manager or to the recruiter, or separate notes, however it works, that shows that you were paying attention and shows your interest, et cetera. And then if you're the hiring manager and maybe you're interviewing 4 or 5 candidates for the same job, you also want to do the same thing, because in your head, sometimes it can get, a little messy after a busy day. So it's good to always take notes while things are fresh and top of mind.
I appreciate what you said there about on both sides, kind of taking notes and understanding, as well as the thank you email. I find, you know, do that, but make it sincere and personalized. Like, there's
Right.
nothing worse than getting the generic version where you've created a template and you're just sending it and it doesn't have any meat from the conversation you just had. Whereas if you could pull something out, then it shows, like, oh, they were paying attention. This is part of their process, where it is more personalized. And I feel like all of us, have systems and a way of doing things with efficiency in mind. But, like, let's not forget why we're doing these things and add a personal touches throughout, and not just check the box of interview follow up note, interview follow up note. Like, take some time to think about that. I want to ask you, and I know we're running out of time, but I've got a few other ones that I do is, you know, if you could fix one thing about the current hiring process as it relates to project managers, what would it be and why?
Well, that's a good one. If I could fix one thing.
Yeah, putting you on the spot.
I know. I mean, honestly, I think at least from what I've seen, again, I go back to that soft skill management. I think it's really important, both for the candidate's sake and for the hiring manager's sake, to really get a sense of how that person's going to operate and really understand what that looks like relative to the role that you're hiring for. So, just to step back, I guess, if I could fix anything, or what I would like to see more of is hiring managers really having a better understanding what they want that person to do day in and day out. So a lot of
Mhm.
times you could say, I'm hiring a project manager, and it seems kind of generic. I'm hiring. So you can look up specs for project managers, and there's a dime a dozen online. You can download whatever. That's all great. That's okay, fundamental, foundational. But I think what I would like to see be done differently is really take it up a notch and saying, okay, this is obviously what a project manager should be doing relative to what I need them to do. What is it that I'm specifically looking for? And then really do that planfulness to understand the capabilities, the skills that you're going to need to require, and write out those questions in advance. And then again, because I think soft skill management is so underrated, make sure that you're using those scenario-based questions also to get an understanding about how that person's going to think through things and manage in a matrix environment. So I think, like, again, I'm a big believer that a project manager can be a generalist under certain circumstances, and then I'm a big believer that a project manager, depending on the circumstances, might need a subspecialty of skills or capabilities, et cetera, for a very specific type of implementation. So I think it's really important, that prep work and making sure you really understand what you want that person to do and get beyond the fundamental, table stakes questions to really focus in on what you want that role to accomplish.
I really like that. It sounds like kind of revamping what the job description looks like, almost like a scope to some extent, but like, really kind of like what the thank you note, which is really just personalized.
Right.
This is kind of what it is. And it shows that what it is you're looking for, what success looks like before you go out, instead of going out with a generic message and figuring out that you'll figure it out as you go through the process. And like that's just not, especially given the market now, it's just not the most effective way of hiring. Is you're not going to have options. Like you got to be clear up front, so that messaging, you're attracting the right people and having
Right.
the conversations right away.
Exactly. I mean, time is money for everybody. You wanna make sure you're getting the right person for the right role. So, listen, I have seen, job descriptions for project managers that are so, like, templated out. They tell me nothing about the company or the
Mm,
work. I think job descriptions that get a little bit more personalized when you put them out there on LinkedIn or whatnot, that it goes about who you're reporting to, because I think
mhm.
candidates like to know that more than they used to. They wanna know where they are in the ecosystem. They wanna understand what the role of the group is, and then they wanna understand what their remit is, and if there are specific types of projects that they'll be working on, and what the expectations are. Some of the best job specs that I've seen is, "You're gonna love this." It's like casual to a degree. "You're gonna love this job if you love this, 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 and this." I mean, I saw one, we were playing around with a project manager spec, and it's like, "Need to have a good sense of humor" was one of the requirements. I'm like, "That's a great requirement to have,"
Yeah.
but that if that's part of the culture, that everybody doesn't take themselves too seriously, that you have a good sense of humor. I've seen, project manager specs that weren't afraid to say, "Be afraid to fail fast, learn, and figure out what to do." Not very, just more open-minded, rather than, "Do you know how to use Microsoft Project? Have
Yeah.
you used Agile? Have you used Scale?" All these types of skills type strategy things, which is gonna be in the books, anybody can memorize, versus this is the kind of personality we want. Again, I think that's really trying to understand whether that person's gonna fit in your culture, your values, and, bring to the table what you need them to bring every day.
I think especially in tech, most of them have gone so far on the job description. I'll tell you my favorite that I see is 10 years of infrastructure project management. What does that mean? Like there's absolutely nothing in that statement, and we could rip that apart, but you'd be amazed as to how often you see that.
Yeah.
And that tells me nothing. Like you don't know, that can mean 100 different projects in 100 different areas of the organization. So I think got to be more specific and just more real. Just have a conversation about
Yeah.
what it is. And finally, I want to know about if you could give the a lesson to yourself when you first started, when you were first hiring project managers. If you go back and say, this is the biggest lesson I've learned where I'm sitting now, what would that be?
As somebody interviewing, or as somebody doing, as a candidate, or as the hiring manager?
Let's do one of each.
Okay.
Let's do you as a hiring manager looking at hiring. So you're interviewing for the first time, and then we'll do one as a candidate, what you've learned the most as a project manager.
So I might sound repetitive, but I think when I first started interviewing project managers, I was leveraging the basic fundamental forms of interviewing. So I think some of the lessons learned over time was, one, set the stage in the beginning, let the candidate know that it's a bi-directional conversation. We're both here to learn about each other. There's not there's not many right or wrong answers. I will get really angry if somebody doesn't know the difference between a risk and an issue. That's a pet peeve of mine. But in a by and large way, it's more scenario based. So one, just making sure that we have that open dialogue, and I set the stage that way. Two, scenario based interviewing, I think, is something that, I employed over the last 10 years. I didn't do it in the beginning. Again, I was just going cookie cutter, cookie cutter, cookie cutter. And I think also, uh, not being afraid to open the kimono with the culture of the company as well. So going back to that bi-directional thing, when a candidate gives me an answer about how they would do a thing, manage a stakeholder, I'll be like, well, just so you know, in this company, if you do that, here would be kind of the expectation. How does that make you think? Or how does it make you feel? Do you think that works for you or doesn't work for you? How would you do it differently? Which also gives them a sense, one, of your culture, but you, how they might be able to adapt to your culture. So don't be afraid to show what the company brings to the table. So often, we interview a candidate, we want to hear everything about them, and we don't give them the opportunity to learn about the company or learn about you as the hiring manager or you as a stakeholder, et cetera. So I think it's important for both people to be vulnerable, if you will, just to get a good feeling for the fit. I think also very important is to make sure to leave time at the end for questions, but really do it. Meaning a lot of times they'll say, "Oh, we'll leave time," and then there's, "Well, I know we're coming up on time. We're actually 1 minute over, but do you have any questions?" That, because you can learn so much about a candidate by the kinds of questions that they ask. To the conversation earlier, at the top of this, what are they interested in? Are they probing you deep enough? What do they care about? Because if somebody asks me the question, I'll be quite honest. If somebody says to me, at the end of an interview, and it's the first interview, and they ask me, well, can I expense my telephone? Probably not the question to be asking me on the first interview. But then it tells me, okay, they're kind of tasky oriented. They should be worried about whether this is the best job for them. We can worry about the phone later. If this is the best job, we'll figure out the phone situation. So it's those types, but you can learn a lot about a candidate by the kind of questions that they ask. So you really do want to leave the time. So I think those are the three big things: is set up the interview right, make sure it's bi-directional, and you're giving them a sense of what the company and you are about as much as you're trying to learn about them, and really do leave time for questions. So that's on that side. As a candidate side, I would say it really depends on where you are in your career and what you're looking for. So are you out of work and looking, or are you kind of exploring, et cetera? All I would say though, and this is something, just, it's really important, and there's so much social media about this, so I hate to sound like I'm pivoting off that, but it's important to really be open-minded. So one of the things I think is key is, a lot of times we pray we get the job offer. We want to get the job offer. We're interviewing maybe for 3 or 4 different places. Please, I want to get this job. I want to get this job. I don't know if that's the right thing to ask. I think the better thing to ask of yourself is to say, I'm going to stay open-minded. I'm going to keep asking questions. I'm gonna do my own research about this job. I'm gonna speak to friends, family, colleagues, industry, et cetera, about what I think this job is about. And I'm gonna try to, what all I really want to do is I want to have the wisdom to make good judgments. So I ask the right questions that will lead me to a situation or to a point where I can say, I'm 70% confident that this is the best bet to place, or I'm 90% confident. At the end of the day, both the hiring manager and the candidate, you're placing bets on each other. Nobody really knows till you get there how it's all going to work out. But I think it's important to have a high degree of confidence. And the only way you can have a high degree of confidence is if you allowed yourself to think through different scenarios and different types of work. And what I mean by that is, again, it depending on where you are in your career, if you're just starting out or if you're older, then you might have different things that you're looking at, but you want to be open-minded that there might be ways to apply your skills, your capabilities, your vision, the things that motivate you in an industry or a type of work that might not be what you thought it would be. So I'll give you a personal example. I started my career in project management. I grew up, if you will, in project management accidentally and then purposefully in project management. But a lot of times in project management, especially as I grew in my career and I had more of a PMO perspective, my view across a company became much more horizontal versus just in my lane vertical. And I'm a see something, say something kind of person. And that led me to knocking on the corner office door every now and then to saying, hey, I was in this meeting and I heard this, and I was in that meeting and I heard that, or I saw this email, and either is synergistic. I hate that word, but there you go, synergistic, or it's conflicting with each other. Does it make sense? And what that started to do is whether implicitly and then explicitly become that kind of chief of staff kind of role, and I started to do that to the point that the C-suite would be like tapping because I was more boots on the ground, I was in it. They weren't hearing things up in the corner office, and so they started to rely on me to feed them signals, which were great because we were able to cut through things. But that led me to taking my career in different direction over time where I actually explicitly did the chief of staff thing, gave it a go. I explicitly did the COO thing, gave it a go because I was curious again. So keeping that open mind as you're a candidate, recognizing that your skills and capabilities can be transferred, you know, doing your due diligence, speaking to your industry, um, trying to make good judgment calls, saying, and then leading you to a path like maybe I'm going to try that and give it a go. I think can land you in all different kinds of directions, which could be a good learning experience.
I think ending it there on those tips, amazing. Serena, thank you so much for all of your time on this episode. I had a blast. I hope you did too. I told you it was going to be fun and conversational, right? So, and thank you so much. And I will put, your LinkedIn where you are so people can connect with you and kind of follow along with all your tips.
In terms of that, people connect with me if you're a hiring manager, but also connect with me if you're a project manager looking for some tips and tricks. I'm happy to have a conversation. We'll get on video. Happy to have a conversation and talk it through and help out any way I can, wherever you are on the spectrum.